And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, who is Marianne Franks, who is a professor at the University of Miami. She also is the Legislation and Tech Policy Director at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and she is the architect of model legislation for revenge porn statutes that have been used throughout the country. We're very lucky to have her. I'm so pleased that she could be here. So let's welcome Marianne Franks.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to speak to you. One of the themes of the conference, I guess, and one of the themes of Me Too is the importance of storytelling. And so I'd like to start by talking about a myth, a Greek myth in particular, that some of you may be already familiar with, and that's the myth of Philomela. So Philomela was the sister of a woman named Procne, and Procne was married to the king of Thrace, Tereus. And she wanted to visit her sister, and she made plans to visit her sister, and Tereus is the one who brings her to a cabin, supposedly in order to have this visit with her sister, but instead, he rapes her. And he tells her, if you tell anyone, I'll hurt you. So he basically threatens her to keep silent. And she tells him that she will defy him. And there are several artistic renderings of what she says in response. And one of those poetic renderings is, she tells him, my mournful voice, the pitying rocks shall move, and my complainings echo through the grove. Hear me, O heaven, and if a God be there, let him regard me and accept my prayer. And what Tereus does then is he cuts out her tongue because he doesn't want her to speak. So that's one myth of what we think or what we fear when it comes to women speaking and what they might say. And another one that many people are probably more familiar with is the myth of Cassandra, the cursed prophetess. So Cassandra has the gift of prophecy. She can tell the future. She does so accurately. But there's a catch. She was in the temple one day, and as the myth says, Apollo was attracted to her and attempted to have sex with her in the temple, and she refused. And as punishment for her refusal, he cursed her so that no one would ever believe the things that she would tell. And so the stories about Cassandra are stories about her trying to warn the people around her of impending destruction. The day that the Trojan horse comes in, she tries to tell them, she tries to say, look, don't trust this, right? There's something terrible that's about to happen. And instead of believing her, the people taunt her, they insult her, they beat her, they stop her from physically trying to go and prevent the Trojan horse from entering, and therefore creating the destruction of Troy. So that's another story about what we think of when we think of women speaking. And it's not just in mythology that we can think about the fear of women's speech or the disbelief about women's speech. We have, unfortunately, far too many real-life examples of the things that people will do, the lengths that they will go to keep women from speaking. And just to pick one out of history, 1838, Pennsylvania Hall. This was one of the first attempts by suffragists, these women who were advocating for the right to vote, to hold a convention about women's rights and about the abolition of slavery. And the convention was going to bring together white women, white people, black men. Everybody was supposed to come together, give a bunch of speeches about the wrongness of slavery and the wrongness of female subordination. And as these speakers were attempting to speak, the townspeople converged upon the hall and started throwing sticks and rocks at the speakers. They broke into the hall at some point and started to try to physically assault the speakers. And eventually what happened was they set the entire hall on fire. Another example of being very concerned about the consequences of women speaking. And then we can move to any number of individual examples, harassment, violence, the kinds of things that happen to women when they say something that especially men don't want to hear. That it may result in death threats, rape threats, or possibly even actual physical violence in some cases. We can contrast that, interestingly, I think, with what is, especially in the last few years, become an extremely fashionable way of talking about speech. Free speech absolutism. The idea that everybody should be able to say what they want to say, no matter how dangerous it might sound. So we have been subjected to the spectacle of people saying all kinds of horrific, terrible things that are disturbing, that might be slanderous. And we are told that these people who are engaging in that kind of speech are actually heroes, right? The fact that they are coming onto college campuses and slandering feminists or transgender individuals, that makes them brave because they are being politically incorrect. They are telling things that nobody wants to hear. And sometimes that leads to violence. Sometimes it leads to people bringing guns to a rally. Sometimes it means that somebody's going to get into their car and drive into a crowd of unarmed protesters. But we are told that is exactly why we have to protect free speech. The fact that it's a dangerous project, the fact that speech can sometimes create disruptions, that it can sometimes lead to violence, that's all the more reason, according to this attitude, that we should protect it. Now, we may say that that attitude in the last few years has been gender neutral. We're just talking about speech. But there's another way of looking at this to say, well, maybe we're not really talking about just speech. We're talking about primarily men's speech. And when men want to speak, the consequences be damned. If it turns out that their threats or their defamation or their incitement actually leads to real violence, well, we're just going to have to tolerate that because it's brave and because sometimes things are messy and ideas are scary. And so those of us who would protest against that and say, well, maybe there should be more regulation of what sometimes people can say in some places, the answer is no, you can't do that. That would mean basically setting the First Amendment on fire. So then we might expect that when a movement blossoms up into this environment where people are speaking boldly, speaking heroically, at great cost to themselves, that are shaking things up, that are telling people things that they may not want to hear, that might lead to certain legal consequences, that have not yet necessarily led to any violence, but might. Maybe we would expect that that kind of movement would be championed by the very same people that have been championing free speech for the last couple of years with such enthusiasm. We might really embrace those kinds of movements and say, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about, brave people speaking up. Because that is, in many ways, what the Me Too movement has been. It's been a series of stories. It's been a moment where women have taken center stage and they have said, I have something to say. Now that might be a story about a rape. It might be a story about a sexual assault allegation. It might be, I think the law should be changed. It could be any number of things, but I want to speak. And almost immediately, there's been a backlash. Oh, when we said we wanted free speech, we didn't know that's what you meant. We didn't know that you meant you wanted to shake up that kind of order. We didn't know that the kind of risks that you were willing to take and that you thought the rest of us should listen to and bear were these types of risks. So immediately, even before, almost before the Me Too movement gets anywhere, there's already people saying it's gone too far. It's gone too far because it's not careful enough. It's not making the right kinds of distinctions. It's moving together all kinds of things that shouldn't be moved together. There's a story about rape, and then there's a story about groping, and then there's a story about exposure, and these things are simply distinct, and they shouldn't be talked about together. In other words, women, you may be allowed to speak at this point, but not that way. Let's try to roll it back, dial it down a little bit. And it makes us wonder why the speech is considered so frightening, why people are so worried about the speech that even before almost it's gotten off the ground, we have to be worried about whether it's gone too far and what the consequences might be. And part of that is the interpretation of what's being told is very much in dispute. There is certainly a lot of what is happening when it comes to this Me Too movement that is directed at actual change. That is to say, the goal is to do something different in the world. Sometimes when someone makes an accusation, it is because they in fact want there to be some kind of legal process. They want some kind of justice for what's been done. Sometimes they want to take hold of the law and say the law should be different if this is what it has been like so far. A really important part of Me Too, of course, has been the exposure of how much silencing women have experienced when they've tried to talk about sexual assault or sexual harassment. So we have these interesting conversations about the existence of non-disclosure agreements and how they literally silence women and keep them from speaking about the things they want to talk about. And you have, even before the Me Too backlash began, the very common response to many allegations of sexual harassment and assault, the defamation lawsuit, as a way of telling these women, if you talk about what happened, I will make sure that no one believes you. I will sue you so that you cannot speak. I will claim that you are speaking falsely even before you have begun to speak. So some of these stories are about that. Right? Some of these stories are about pointing out the injustice of non-disclosure agreements and about defamation law and about how, when we try to talk about advocacy for free speech, we so often don't seem to mean free speech for women. We seem to mean something quite different. So that part of this could be seen as a legal movement. Right? If we're thinking about what does Me Too mean for the law, well, in some ways the answer is, well, Me Too is trying to articulate something about how the law has to change. Maybe we need to change actual policies, really concrete policies like this, whether or not there should be arbitration agreements, whether or not we should have NDAs, what the problems might be when it comes to defamation lawsuits against people who are alleging sexual harassment and assault. And more broadly speaking, whether or not women can center their own experiences and use those to say that's what the law should be. So for instance, we can talk about something very specific, the question of revenge porn. Non-consensual pornography, as of a few years ago, most states says not a crime. It's not a problem. But of course, the law isn't something that's written down on stone tablets delivered from God. It's actually something that people have created. And so it is no answer for any form of abuse to say, well, it's not a crime. The question is, why is it not a crime? So in one very specific way, we could say that part of this movement of saying that women should be able to speak, that women should be able to take hold of the law, is for them to do exactly what has happened in the last few years. The victims have taken a hold of that particular form of abuse, and they've said, if this isn't against the law now, it ought to be. And 2013, you only have 3 states that say it's a crime, and now you have 38. That's a change. It's very conscious, and it's very deliberate to say there is no reason for us to accept that the law is a given, because the law is not a given. The law is a series of choices. So a lot of the anxiety about Me Too, a lot of the backlash seems to be focused on exactly the point at which women's speech might become legal speech, that it might actually have these kinds of impacts, that it might actually change something. That seems to be a lot of the anxiety. And a lot of the anxiety seems to predate Me Too and seems to be a little bit more generalized and diffuse. It's the concern about women taking power generally. Right? The specter, the possibility that women might be in power has obviously triggered some kind of dramatic response in this country. So that's part of what we're worried about. And we do see the signs of it. We didn't see the sign, the ultimate sign that many people were looking for, which was to finally have a female head of state. But we have had moments where we've seen something like that future. Just recently, Nancy Pelosi standing on the floor of Congress, literally in the halls of power, standing up 8 hours without interruption. A woman speaking until she's ready to sit down. That, even though not explicitly about Me Too, really does in some ways encapsulate what this moment is, both why it's so interesting and why it's so scary for people. The idea of women speaking the way that they want to speak. But in another sense, the backlash is about misunderstanding. It is to say, to try to make everything that Me Too might be doing into a legal movement. Hence the concerns, well, what about due process? Right? What about other people's rights? Can I no longer even make a joke? There's a sense in which many of the responses have been to say, it's already as though the kinds of things that women are saying, the stories that they're telling, have already made it impossible for me to live my life the way that I would like to live it. Now we know, of course, that that's a fairly hyperbolic way of looking at this world, as though the stories women were telling themselves were going to change overnight what our society does and what it considers acceptable. But another part of the problem is that it certainly is mixed altogether. The stories are not neatly sort of separated into things that I think there should be legal repercussions for and things that I think I just want to talk about. There's that very old cliche, right, about the way that men and women communicate differently, right? That when you talk about a problem to men, supposedly, they want to find solutions, and that sometimes when women talk, they just want someone to hear them. Now, it's an old stereotype and in some ways an offensive stereotype, but there might be a grain of truth that sometimes when women are just trying to be heard, men hear it as, oh, you want me to change something. And sometimes, yes, The answer is yes, and that is a good thing. But sometimes the story is being told for a different reason. Sometimes the story is being told simply to say, this is worth hearing. Because when people are saying things on social media of all places, they're not actually going to be able to jail someone because of that. What they're going to be able to do is tell somebody that what they have to say is important. And again, if we look at all the things that we supposedly care about in this internet age, it's the ability of everyone to be able to speak. Everybody gets to have the outlet. It's democracy. People get to tell their stories. So we should be supportive of that and not overstate what it is we think that they're trying to do. Some of it is about law, some of it isn't. Some of it is about trying to say, there are so many stories here that have never been told or haven't been told in this way, and it's about time that we started to process them. And one important part of that, especially when it's not attached to a certain legal punitive response, is to say, actually, yes, we do need to talk about the unwanted proposition and the sexual assault in the same conversation, because they are importantly related. They are not the same, and very few people, if anyone, is actually trying to argue that they are the same. But is it true that a person who indicates that he essentially sees the women around him as sexual props will do something worse? Probably so. And if part of the point of telling these stories is to diagnose a problem and to try to warn us, all of us, before something happens, then we have to talk about the things that are on the spectrum. We have to talk about the things that have not yet become the terrible story that everyone agrees, what a shame. Because it's easy enough to some extent to hear the terrible stories and say, those stories are terrible. It's much harder to say, well, what about the story before the story? What about all the signs that were there that told us these people were acting in a way that at some point would mean that they would break someone for good? Why haven't we been listening to those stories? Why aren't we connecting these types of ideas? And we're partly refusing to do it because we're saying, oh, it goes too far, it's too fast. But again, if we're listening carefully, sometimes we're just trying to have that conversation. No one is saying you punish a grope the same way that you punish sexual assault, or I should say a rape. What they are saying is these things can't be understood without each other. And we don't have just monsters in our midst who one day wake up and decide that they're going to be a monster. Harvey Weinsteins are created. They are not born. And if we're going to ever get to a point where the law has to do less, because I think on some level most of us would agree we wish the law could do less, partly because we know that the law is there when morals and kindness run out. We would all want the law to have to play a smaller role. But sometimes that's going to require having these conversations. So if someone writes a not particularly well nuanced article or report about a date they had, for instance, that they're trying to articulate something about unwantedness. They're trying to articulate something about that spectrum of sexual behavior. And that it is not a call to arms. It is not a demand that somebody be judged or expelled or imprisoned. That it is a way of saying this is a story that is worth telling. That we have a tendency, especially those of us who are in law, to think in terms of adversaries. That if someone is trying to say what they think is right, they're trying to say that someone else is wrong. If they're trying to say my experience is important, then other people's experiences are not. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Tarana Burke, the woman who started the Me Too movement, she talks about how she wants to make sure that these stories that are getting told are not just repositories. She doesn't think that there's much to be gained by just telling the stories and having them sit there somewhere. She says her goal is to feel like there's a way for people to release their stories. And that's a wonderful way of phrasing it, releasing your story, so that people can learn from it, so that you can use it in some way, so that, in her words, that you can find some kind of joy. That is some part of this conversation as well. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be legal change or. It can be all of these things. Social change. It can be a conversation. It can be, I might be misreading this. It could be, I'm trying something out. It could be, I just want to question this. But ultimately, at every stage, that it is some person who is trying to say, I want to be heard. And the sense in which we are getting this backlash, this concern that when women are heard, something is going to happen that's terrible. Sometimes it gets translated as, well, what's going to happen if the ways that women perceive the world become the way that the law sees all of us. And one answer to that is to say, well, what do you think it's been all this time? It's been someone's vision. Someone has to decide what is reasonable behavior and what is not. Someone has to decide what consent is or isn't. Someone has to decide whether or not rape should be considered something that can happen between a husband and his wife or not. Someone has been making all of those decisions all of this time. And the question is, if we're so worried about women making those decisions, why is that the case? Is it because we actually think that that power to use stories to shape the law and legal concepts is something that only men should be able to wield? Or is it something else? Are we afraid of what it is that women are going to say? Are we afraid about the kinds of burdens we think that they're going to communicate to us? Because once we see something, we now might feel some responsibility to it. So much of the negative reaction to really horrific stories of sexual assault, domestic violence, has something to do with a kind of ego protectiveness. It's not even sometimes that we want to blame the victim so much as we want to excuse ourselves. We really don't want to think that I can see myself in your story, either as a victim or as a perpetrator, because it might mean that some part of me that's essential to who I am might have to change, that there's some part of me that I am quite attached to that might have to undergo some analysis. Or I might want to think, I want to believe that I can protect myself if I only act a certain way. So I want to find out what you were wearing and what you said and what kind of situation you're in so I can reassure myself that because I don't wear that or do this, it won't happen to me. It's as much of a move to say, not me too, as it is anything else. It's a concern about what's going to happen to all of us if we actually hear these stories. But we can imagine a world, and maybe we're getting closer to it, in which really this is the moment for free speech. This is the moment for bold speech. This is the moment where we say the things that are going to be said in these days are actually going to be quite alarming. They're going to be disruptive. They're going to make you uncomfortable. They're going to make you sad. They're going to make you think that the current order is not maybe the best way. And say that means the people who are speaking in those ways, they really are heroic. That is, after all, what free speech is supposed to be about. That the women who stand up and say these things, and we know, not just now, but always, when they've done so, they have been responded to with threats, with harassment, sometimes so that they lose their jobs, so that they are forced to close down their online accounts, so that they're forced to leave their homes. Those women are brave. That kind of speaking is brave. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because it never has been. All the conversations we have in our modern era about freedom of speech and how we all need to tolerate it even if it's really offensive and it hurts our feelings, these are all lessons we should be applying here. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something that we can support because we need to hear it. And as long as it's not causing us actual injury in the moment, then we need to have some tolerance to be able to listen and process. So all of this makes me think about a different kind of myth, and this is one that probably all of you have heard of, the myth of Scheherazade and the Tales of the Arabian Nights. If you remember, it's a really interesting story. You've got the ruler of this kingdom who has a very bad experience. He's married, and he discovers at some point that his wife is cheating on him, and he immediately has her executed. But not only that, he decides that he is going to take a new wife every single night, enjoy her for that night, and in the morning have her executed every single night. And what's happening in this kingdom is that essentially the entire female population is being decimated. Night after night, he kills another woman. Scheherazade, some versions of the stories don't make this clear, but Scheherazade isn't picked by the ruler to become the next victim. She volunteers because she wants the killing of women to stop, and she has a plan. So, when she is picked, and she is supposed to spend the night with the ruler, she has this ploy. She tells her sister, you need to ask as part of the wedding ceremony that I tell you a story, that be the one thing I'm allowed to do before I die. And so this is what happens. She asks her sister for a story, and Scheherazade starts to tell a story. But the story is so compelling and so interesting and so nerve-wracking in some ways, that as dawn is breaking and she's supposed to be executed, she has to stop and say, well, I'm sorry, my time is up. And the ruler says, but I need to know the end of the story. And she says, well, it's too bad that I I'm going to be executed. And he says, okay, I'll give you one more night to tell me the rest of the story. And so the same thing happens the next night. She starts where she left off, tells him this great story, but tells a story throughout the night that, again, as dawn is breaking, she leaves him hanging. And he says, finish the story. She says, well, I can't because I'm about to be executed. And he says, well, okay, I'll give you another night. And it goes on for 1,001 nights. And on the 1,001th night, he finally says, I will not kill you at all. Because as it turns out, he likes listening to her talk. But perhaps more importantly, right, he won't kill anybody else. And that is Scheherazade's story. Women tell stories for many different reasons. Sometimes they tell stories to give witness. Sometimes they tell stories to warn of danger. And sometimes they tell stories to save their lives. Whatever else the Me Too movement is supposed to be teaching us, I think it's teaching us that we always need to listen. Thank you.